I want to talk this morning about food, and I want to continue a theme that I've been talking about throughout these lectures, which is a question that I posed in my first lecture, which is again about problems of analyzing culture, namely whether we can consider culture to be something which is a human universal, or whether it's culturally diverse and specific. And last week on Friday I was giving you the example of time and talking about the possibility that Evans Pritchard had argued that different cultures perceive and conceptualize time in different ways, so that he was giving the example of the Nuer and saying that the Nuer think time differently from ourselves. And I was casting doubt on this, though it's clear that there is the precise manner in which the Nuer talk about and conceptualize time may be Nuer specific, but it's possibly not quite as different as Evans Pritchard wanted to make out. I want to pursue this a bit more to talk about attempts to systematize culture into ideas about rules and codes and underlying systems which are unconscious in the way that grammar is unconscious when we normally speak languages. And again, I want to suggest that there's some mileage in this, but it has quite a lot of limitations. So that on the one hand, there are people like Levi-Strauss in particular, but also Leach, to whom I want to refer, who are arguing that beneath cultural diversity if we strip away cultural content and look at the way cultures are organized and patterned, we can detect similar systemic arrangements cross-culturally. So that's one view. The other view would be the view of Tyler, who once described culture as an unsystematic thing of shreds and patches. And I want to take the example of wedding cakes as an example to show that there is a limit to how cute we can get in interpreting cultural symbolism, so that sometimes what we think of as an ordered symbolic system turns out to be actually the result of rather contingent historical factors. So my question is, can we identify rules and systems to help us understand culture, and what is the limitation of trying to do this? Now, as I've suggested, what structuralism does, what Levi-Strauss in particular tries to do is to seek systematic regularities which underlie the apparent variation between different cultures. And I want to illustrate this by first looking at how he tried to show this with respect to food and cooking. Now, the basic idea of structuralist analysis is the argument that underlying cultures, there is a systematic ordering and logic. And I want to suggest that there are problems about this. The first one, as I say, the fact that often cultures seem to grow up. If we look at them historically, they grow up in a slightly random, haphazard way, so that what looks like system may not be system after all. I also then want to talk about to go in the opposite direction from Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss, using the model of language and grammar, is suggesting that there's an unconscious underlying system behind cultures. And what I want to do with respect to Jain food, the Jains are a religious group in India, I want to show that actually people can be quite conscious of their cultural system and use them politically for political ends. In other words, far from being an unconscious system, people are actually manipulating cultural systems to enhance their own status. Now, again, I want to emphasize that it is a mistake if you get the idea that these theories are right or wrong. They're not right or wrong, they're simply ways of looking at things. Each one gets or brings us a certain level of understanding, but also brings problems in its wake. Now, what Levi-Strauss Levi-Strauss's starting out point was a critique of a number of previous writers, including Malinowski, but many others before Malinowski, who had argued that so-called primitive peoples thought differently from Western peoples. And so that in the argument of somebody called Levi-Bruhl talked to something called a pre-logical mentality amongst primitive people, which then gave rise, through a process of evolution, to our own much more rational system of thought. In Malinowski's view, it wasn't that people were illogical, but simply that they didn't have the time, they weren't interested in elaborating symbols or cultural systems. They were what he called primitive pragmatists. In other words, that the logic of their cultures was essentially a utilitarian logic. And what Levi-Strauss tries to demonstrate, and demonstrates very convincingly, is that what he calls the pensée sauvage, which is a pun, but we can translate it as savage thought, but what he calls savage thought is, in fact, we can show that it's an elaborate philosophical system concerned with existential concepts, existential ideas, but that whereas we tend to think in abstract terms, other non-literate societies tend to think concretely. In other words, they use things out there, animals, plants, food, etc., as devices with which to encode cultural messages. And I've given you an example of this. We do it sometimes so that we can take a system of colors on college scarves to encode the differences between colors can be used to encode ideas about different colleges in this case, in other words, different social groupings. And I will give you various other examples of what Levi-Strauss means by what he called the logic of the concrete, of which college scarves is an example, in other lectures. So I shall also talk about this with respect to animals in my next lecture. So that what Levi-Strauss is saying is that we can either say, look, there are colleges in a series A, B, C, D, E, which is an abstract logic, or we can say there are colleges in a series red, blue, green, etc., which is a concrete logic. We're using things out there to encode social ideas. So what Levi-Strauss is trying to do is to identify the categories that we use to think with. And he emphasizes that the categories, in this case food or colors, the categories are constant, but the content, the meaningful content that we give them may be very different, so that we may think that white symbolizes purity, but if we look cross-culturally in other societies, white has quite different connotations. Now, Levi-Strauss suggests that food and animals are that they are in a sense the privileged domain of the logic of the concrete. And he suggests this because both of them, both food and animals, are in a sense about, we use animals and food to think about the distinction between ourselves and nature. So that in Levi-Strauss's thought, at the rock bottom of human culture is this idea that we uniquely have culture whilst other animals do not have culture. So that, in other words, he's suggesting that underlying the diversity of different cultures, there are common preoccupations, and one of them has to do with the way we think food. And at the rock bottom, we think food because food, or cooking, it is cooking which distinguishes us from other animals. Animals feed, but we eat food, and when we eat food, we cook it. In other words, that's the first rule that we apply to food, that normally we eat our food cooked. And then we apply a whole series of secondary rules which are about how we elaborate food and those secondary rules serve to make secondary cultural distinctions. So the primary distinction is between humans and animals, and then the secondary distinctions are between various categories of food. And so that the manner of preparation of food, what is eaten, how it's eaten, table manners, etc., all of these things serve to convey social information. In other words, food is about rules and about choices, and rules don't exist in nature. So for Levi-Strauss then, food is situated between nature and culture, or cooking is situated between is situated between nature and culture. It's a way we can use it as a way of thinking about relations between categories. And by extension, as I say, we can use it as a way of thinking about different social groups. So there's a common way we do this, so that some of us still impolitely refer to the French as frogs because they eat frogs, and the French characteristically refer to us sometimes as rosbif because we eat beef, and we can extend this, the Germans are krauts, etc., because they eat sauerkraut. So here we have an example in which we're using food differences to connote group differences. But of course we can use food to all sorts of other things. We can use food to distinguish classes or subclasses, religious ideologies, etc. So that different groups, if we look at the connotations of pork, eating pork, that marks out in particular Jewish and Islamic peoples. They don't eat pork, other people do eat pork, etc. So that vegetarianism, not eating meat is in many societies either a collective religious symbol or in our own society a kind of personal religious symbol. In other words, food can be used to signify a system of social differences in rather the same way that colours can be used to signify a system of social differences. Now, as I said, Levi-Strauss took his cue from linguistics, and as an experiment playing around, Levi-Strauss tried to make his ideas hyper rigid and hyper formal. So here we have Jacobson's primary vowel consonant triangle. What Jacobson is saying is that languages are made up of different sounds. But we can go one, so that I've given you examples of it in previous lectures, but we can go one further than this and say, what is it about the sounds? What are the differences which make the differences between sounds? So here we have A, U, and I, or K, P, and T. And according to the linguists, these sounds differ along two axes, one of which is what they call compact or diffuse, which is, in other words, the amount of noise energy that is involved. So that A has a large amount of noise energy relative to U and E. So in other words, they're distinguished on that direction by the amount of noise, and on this direction by low frequency versus high frequency sounds. So obviously U is a low frequency sound, whilst E is a high frequency sound. You can play around, if you think about the triangle B, M, and P, you can see that one of the what are so-called distinctive features is that when you say M, you make a noise through your nose, whilst when you say B, you don't make a noise through your nose, etc. So that the presence or absence of nasalization is distinguishing the two sounds. Now this is highly technical stuff, and all you need to remember is what are called phonemes, which are the sounds in a language which are chosen to convey difference in meaning. Phonemes, like B and M in English, inside phonemes there are a set of what are called distinctive features. In other words, B and M differ by the presence or absence of nasalization. So that's what's meant by a distinctive feature. And what Levi-Strauss suggests is that the same applies to cooking, so that underlying all systems of cooking, we have differences in the way that food is produced. So that this is his basic idea, is that just like phonemes are distinguished by distinctive features, so that food is distinguished either on the axis of culture and nature, so that cooked food is elaborated, transformed by a cultural process, whilst rotten food is elaborated by a natural process. So that's the axis culture nature, whilst on this one, raw food is in an untransformed state, whilst both cooked food and rotten food are in a transformed state. So that what he's trying to say is that in thinking food, we make distinctions between raw food, cooked food, between boiled food and rotten food, etc. And we can elaborate this much more. Here's a more elaborate version. So here we have roast food, rotted food, and cooked food, the three primary terms in his series. And this is air, so that when you roast food, you cook it without the medium of air. In other words, the fire is applied directly to the food, whilst when you smoke food, there is air between the fire and the food. So that here, that notionally roast food is closer to the raw state, as those of you who eat like your meat rare will remember that. So that's how this system is working. And on this system, you have, when you boil food, you use water as the medium, etc. And boiled food is towards the axis of rotten, which you all know from your college lunches. When you have cabbage in your colleges, it's fairly close to rotten cabbage. So, or it smells fairly close to rotten cabbage. At least it does in King's. I'm sure in other colleges it doesn't. So anyhow, this is Levi-Strauss trying to develop a system of distinctive features: raw, cooked, rotten, roast, boiled, etc., in cultural systems of meals. Now, if you think for a moment, there is a sense in which this does apply, in that, for instance, if you eat a standard posh British meal in a restaurant, what do you start with? Well, you normally start with something which is, the typical starter is soup, which is a wet, liquid form of food, and then that is marked, the next food is relatively dry, and in Spanish, that second course is called el seco, the dry, so that the category, what do you want for your seco, means what do you want for the second course, which in Colombia, where I work, you can guarantee that it will be pretty dry too. It'll be a piece of rather overcooked meat plus some rice, and indeed it is very dry indeed. So that you go from wet to dry, and then what do you get? Then you get another axis which is coming in, which is savory versus sweet. So that the next phase of the meal is dessert, which is contrasting the other bit. And if you're in England, you eat your, I can't remember, we eat our dessert first, and then our cheese second, whilst in France you do it the other way around. So that we have appropriate rules as to how we construct meals. And one could go further. If using these categories, you can elaborate status distinctions in meals, so that boiled food, boiled stews, etc., kind of familial domestic things, whilst roast food is very much a more high status food that you would offer to guests, etc. So that we can see that Levi-Strauss has a point that up to a certain point, food systems or meal systems are employing different categories, different distinctive features between foods, and people in different cultures get it wrong. So that when the British, it is said, I don't know whether it's true, but it's said that when the British troops invaded Normandy, they destroyed the camembert factories because they thought they were disgusting because it smelt of rotting food, etc. So this was a typical healthy British attitude to foreigners' food. Now, so what do we conclude from all this? Well, we conclude that it is the case that cultures and subunits of cultures, in other words, cultured systems, are indeed structured systems, and we can show this to some extent using this example of food. And I ask you to go away and play with this for yourselves in your own head, and you will see that to some extent it works. And what Levi-Strauss is suggesting is that, in part at least, these tokens, these concrete things, here food, don't necessarily have meaning in themselves. They mean simply in relation to one another. Their meaning, if they convey any information, it's simply by contrast. In other words, you can't say, what do sweets mean? But you can say that they are in some sense in an ordered contrastive relation with savory food, etc. So that's the first point, is that cultures to some extent are indeed built up of systems of difference in the same way that languages can be built up by systems of difference. And the second point that Levi-Strauss is making is that these systems, or structures as he calls them, are typically unconscious. You are very happily all the time talking with ters and kers and pers, etc., but you don't, as you speak, start saying, oh, well, that one, when I say mummy, that's got a nasal one, whilst I say battle, that's unnasalized. You're doing this all the time without thinking about it, but nonetheless, you are employing an unconscious system of differences. And the third point that Levi-Strauss is making is that customs or rules in one cultural domain, here food, can be used to say something about distinctions in another domain, so that you can use food to talk social groups. And I've given you the example of the fact that quite often we talk about other groups, or we refer to them by what they eat, etc. Much elaborated by foodies, who every year we have the foodie press, which has enormous class and status distinctions, which are made by the current year's fashionable foods, etc. So that suddenly one year rhubarb is written up in the Sunday Times and Sunday colour supplements as the in food, so everybody starts eating rhubarb, and then next year it's dropped and it's sun-dried tomatoes, etc. So that here we have a system in which minute fads and fashions about food are used to mark in-groups and out-groups, etc. Well, up to a point this works, but I think the problem with it is that it's extremely complicated and also rather over-formal. We can bring it slightly more down to earth using a second example, which is Leach's classic paper called Animal Categories and Verbal Abuse. Leach starts out with the question, why is it that cross-culturally animals are used as insults? So that some of us call the police pigs, we talk about people as being son of a bitch, we refer to the female pudenda as pussy. In Spain, you talk about adulterers as goats, cabron, etc. So that this way of, in Amazonia, if you want to insult somebody, you call them an inedible animal, baigu. So why is it that we choose these animals to insult each other with? And why some animals, not others? Why son of a bitch rather than son of an elephant? What's wrong with elephants? Why can't we all son of an opossum? Wouldn't work. Well, Leach's answer to this is because food is also about sex. In other words, that we are using food and animals as a symbolic system to talk sex. And because the system of food animals which feed us and are also fed by us, is also about sex and marriage. And Leach suggests that because the animals we eat are also linked up with our ideas about sexuality and marriage, we then treat some animals ritually, and indeed we do treat animals ritually. The press over the last couple of years has been filled by endless, rather tedious and incredibly convoluted discussions about the rights and wrongs of fox hunting. And at stake is the right of a series of people to dress up in fancy dress on Saturdays and Sundays and to chase a rather innocuous vermin, the fox, across the fields. And there's a lot of debate about whether fox hunting is a more efficient or less efficient way of eradicating foxes than simply shooting them with guns. But of course that's not really the point. The point is that this is a way of life, a lifestyle and a ritual, etc. So here we have an obvious example about the ritualization of killing animals, but of course we don't eat foxes, but there is another section of the population who dress up in equally funny clothes and shoot pheasants, and they do indeed eat them, and they eat them in a very special way. The people who really like to eat pheasants eat them what they call high, which in ordinary parlance is semi-rotten. But we don't eat farm animals in that way. You do eat beef a little bit high, but you certainly wouldn't eat pork or lamb high. But curiously enough, most of the farm animals we eat are castrated, sometimes for technical or taste reasons, but that I don't think is the end of the story. Now what Leach is arguing is that this system here talks of this system here. So that Leach says that there are, if we look at it, we have a series of parallel systems. So here's the space system: self, your house, the farmyard, the field, and far away. Here is the kinship and marriage system: self, family, kin, neighbors, strangers. And here's the animal system: self, pets, farm animals, game, and wild animals. And what Leach is suggesting is that it's in this area here in particular, it's in these three areas that we get animals being particularly associated with various kinds of sexuality. On the one hand, we have animals which are tabooed, we don't eat them: dogs and cats. They might be tabooed, they might be inedible, but they're, in a sense, they are very close to us. They're like members of our family, because hence we don't eat them. But lurking behind it is the possibility of a kind of incestuous relationship. So that one end of the spectrum, we get a lot of verbal abuse associated with pet animals: dogs, bitches, pussies, etc. We get this, here is the level at which, so you can't marry within your own group. In this area, this is the area in which this is the interface between marriage and non-marriage. And here, says Leach, we get another area of verbal abuse. So that at this end, domestic animals are a bit like pets, but they're problematic pets. They're pets we eat. So we get another concentration of a verbal abuse. And at this end, we get effectively marriage relationships which are encoded in our verbal abuse systems. Any of you who've been to the Playboy Club will see it very clearly. The Playboy Club is a most bizarre institution where young ladies dress up with rabbits and with rabbit ears and a little tail, and it's called a bunny club. But those of you who know your history of bunnies will know that bunnies come from the word cunny or coney, and that cunny is very closely related to cunt. So that a bunny club is none other than a cunny club. And if you look historically in the derivation of these words, you see these patterns very clearly. Bunnies are cunnies. Venery, hunting, venal, venery is also sex, venereal disease, etc. So that when we're dressing up to hunt foxes, we're engaged in venery, in other words, metaphorically, in sexual relations. Well, it's convincing up to a point. Leach is right that there is something very peculiar about the way that we use language to insult each other, and he's certainly right that when we talk animal, we're talking food and talking sex. And there are endless crossovers in popular culture, etc., between food and sex. The statement, "I could eat you," doesn't mean cannibalism. If any of you have seen the film Tom Jones, the bit where the man eats the pear, that's one of the most erotic bits of film ever made, but all he's doing is eating a pear, apparently. In other words, Leach is bringing the formal system of Levi-Strauss down more onto the ground, so that we're moving from abstract grammars, codes, and formal systems to how food categories relate, how precisely do food categories relate to social distinctions, and how they relate to economic distinctions, etc. But of course, this is still largely unconscious. It's still a largely unconscious system which is claimed, according to Leach, to underlie and therefore to explain social relations. As I say, I don't think he's wrong exactly. I think it's an interesting essay, and he gives some part answers, and I think he certainly draws attention to bits of culture which we take for granted. We don't normally reflect on why it is that we use language in this way, but indeed we do. But it's all a bit too neat, and there are many criticisms that have been, there are all sorts of contingent factors which actually intervene in all this, which I don't want to go into. That the system is over neat, and plenty of people have written articles in criticism of Leach which have pointed out precisely that the argument is over neat, though he has a point. Now what I want to do, so I want to turn now. So here are two, what I've given you so far is a very, very hard bit structuralist version of cultural categories, abstract universal categories underlying systems of food. And then I've given you a more friendly, down-to-earth, socially informed version of the same thing. And what Leach is doing is applying ideas from Levi-Strauss to a specific example, namely verbal abuse and animal categories. Now I want to give you two examples that question these tidy, formal, rule-bound ideas about culture, and in this case, rule-bound ideas about food. And my first example is going to be a book by Simon Charsley called Wedding Cakes and Cultural History. Charsley did his field research in Scotland, but much of what he says would apply in down south also. My second example I want to give is using some work by a colleague here in Cambridge called James Laidlaw, who did research on the Jains in Rajasthan. But let's begin with Simon Charsley's Wedding Cakes. What Charsley starts out by observing is that the wedding cake is the central compulsory part of the British wedding, and it's remarkably consistent. Right across Britain, magically, when you go to a wedding, you have the same standard formula cake. It's always made of 3 tiers, supported on little pillars. There's usually a bride and groom up the top. There are all sorts of variations, but the basic form is the same. This is the wedding cake. It's 3 tiers, it's normally white, and if it's not white, it blends, very often blends in. If the bride isn't wearing white, sometimes the bride and her cake match colours. So if the bride wears pastel blue, lo and behold, the cake is pastel blue. It's usually a rich fruit cake inside. Now one of the central bits of the British wedding is the cutting of the cake. Now why do you have any answers? What is meant, what is the symbolism behind cutting the cake? You have a good smile on your face. What it's about?
Having kids with the wife.
Yeah, well that's what I hoped you'd say. So it's all about a symbolic violation of the bride's virginity in the context of marriage, legitimate violation, and it matches up with the ring symbolism and the best man speech. Putting a ring on something is fairly obvious too. So Charsley's argument was that this is an obvious symbol of well-being, an obvious symbol of fertility, etc. And that it's about fertility, good luck, etc. Now there are two, what he then goes to, that's what he thought was the case, and then he subverts his own argument by arguing that actually if we look historically this turns out to be not the case. And it also turns out to be not the case because in Charsley's sample, unlike you, sir, in Charsley's sample only one person came up with the explanation that Charsley was looking for. And they came up with it in a rather amusing way. So what Charsley says is that if we look historically at what happens with the wedding cake, it seems to be that an awful lot of it just happens for other reasons. So that for starters, we can trace the origin of the wedding cake way back to the Middle Ages when sugar was a very rare, high-status commodity. And in those days, the rich used to display sugar. They used to make extraordinary concoctions. If you read a book by Mintz called Sweetness and Power, Sidney Mintz, you will see all this explained in great detail. In the Middle Ages, people displayed sugar because it was posh stuff. It was high-status food. So that one of the ingredients of the wedding cake is simply the display of wealth and sugar. But then people invented something called royal icing. And royal icing made possible even better displays because you can pipe royal icing and make all those frilly bits around the edges. You can imagine that around here there's all that stuff, the sort of frou-frou around the edges. Well, royal icing was great for decoration, but it was lousy for cutting because it turns out to be extremely hard. And prior to the invention of royal icing, there was a different form of ceremony. Cutting was a different operation because in the prior to royal icing, the cake was a relatively flat slab, and the cutting was an exclusive ceremony for the bride, not the bride and groom. What the bride did was cut huge slabs of cake which were distributed to everybody. And so in that point, the symbolism was associated with the bride's nurturing role. She was practicing being the kind of mum of the family who would feed her little ones, etc. But once you got royal icing, it turned out that the bride found it rather difficult to get into the cake. So along they wheel out the groom to help her. So that then they invented a new cutting ceremony. So prior to royal icing, it was the bride who cut the cake and distributed large quantities. And as you know, nowadays it's the bride and the groom is supposed to sort of put his hand on the cake and help the bride. And then you get those little tiny, then they don't bother to cut up the rest of the cake at all. In the old days, the bride cut the whole thing, but nowadays the bride and groom just do one cut, and then you distribute it to the professional caterers who make it into those silly little bits that are distributed. In other words, the form of the cake was not, as Charsley had imagined, dictated or derived from any underlying system of meanings at all. It happens because of a series of historical contingencies. First, to do with the displaying of sugar. Secondly, the invention of royal icing. The symbolism comes not from a system of culture like that. The object, in other words, came first, and its size, shape, decoration, etc. are often dictated as much by technical considerations as symbolic considerations. And the symbolic elaboration comes afterwards, and as the technicalities of the cake, as its form and consistency changes, so the symbolic meanings change. And so that the ceremonial usage was changed to accommodate the changes at other levels. There was no single underlying logic at all. So that the ideas associated with the cake were in fact added to the cake at different points over the course of history. So that, for instance, the sexual connotation between the bride and cake was also, in the 18th century, it had a different form again. In the 18th century, the groom passed bits of cake through his wedding ring and then handed them out to unmarried girls. But that one died out in the 19th century, and there was a long gap between this particular series of sexual symbolism and what we have today. And in fact, the actions may be detached absolutely from the original purpose of the cake entirely, so that in contemporary Japan we have inedible cakes. In Japan, apparently, they have special cakes which are made of cardboard, and they have a special replica molded rubber icing, and they have a special slot in the rear for a knife to be inserted. And when the bride and groom insert the knife and apparently cut the cake, there's a large puff of smoke, so that it's a nice photo opportunity. And Charsley says that there is no symbolic interpretation given at all, and wisely the Japanese don't seem to be commenting on their own sexuality and the symbolism of puffs of smoke. The second point that Charsley discovered was that actually what people said didn't conform to his hypothesis at all, because virtually nobody suggested the sexual symbolism at all. That would be no problem for Levi-Strauss, of course, because for Levi-Strauss cultural codes operate unconsciously. But Charsley is looking for conscious meaning. In Charsley's sample, only one couple came up with the idea of sexual symbolism, and because the bride concerned knew about it, she decided to have no cake at all. And here is what she said. She said, "I think the whole idea is disgusting. I don't see why I should have to make a statement about my sexuality, especially as my husband doesn't have to do so too." So that the one person who was conscious of the symbolism rejected it entirely. Okay, so that here we have an example in which what might at first sight look like a tidy symbolic system turns out to be what Tyler called a system of shreds and patches, haphazard accretions over the course of history. Now, my last example has to do with examples where people use food symbolism consciously, and again you will see that the links between sexuality and eating are there. And the example comes from India, in which elaborate systems of cooking, in which we find elaborates of cooking and caste stratified systems of cuisine. Here we get rules of cooking, pollution, and eating, which are combined up with elaborate ideas about the moral consequences of eating particular food. So that, for instance, in religious offerings, the deities are graded according to the food you offer them. At the top of the system are vegetarian deities, below that are meat-eating deities, and below that are deities who drink alcohol and smoke dope, so that we have a graded series. What you give to the deity represents his or her status. And the pervasive use, and we also find that food is pervasively used as a relative marker of relative social status between the giver and the receiver. So that if you're a high status Brahmin, you can only accept certain kinds of food from lower status people, because you might be polluted if you accept all foods. And that's one of the reasons why Brahmins are typically used as cooks. And in fact, a lot of Indian restaurants in Britain are done by Brahmin families, because Brahmins, because they're in a high state of purity, can feed everybody. Now, the Jains are a particular high status group of urban traders and bankers, and their religion is focused upon male and female renouncers. These are the people who give up their positions and travel from place to place and live on alms, so that if you renounce the world, you become high status. And food in this system is of extreme importance, because it's the rigorous diet that in particular marks off the Jain status as an exclusive, very high status group within high status caste society. By their own criteria, the Jains are more strictly vegetarian than anybody else. And they claim that their own distinct diet marks their own distinct status in society. But in fact, their ideas about food are shared by most sections of Indian society. And in a sense, they have to be shared, because if they weren't shared, other people wouldn't understand the message that the Jains are trying to convey through their own particular ways of cooking and eating. Now, the most important shared idea in this system is that food transfers moral qualities between people. So that, as I say, low-caste people cannot feed high-caste people because low-caste people are polluted and would pollute people of high caste. And some foods transfer these qualities much more readily than others, so that there's a distinction between what is called kaka food, which is raw food, and paka food, which is cooked food. Raw food is relatively safe, whilst cooked food is much more dangerous. And boiled rice is in fact the most effective medium of transfer of all, so that boiled rice is the thing that you really have to look out for if you're concerned about being polluted by others. In other words, we can see already that food transactions tell us a great deal about status in Indian society. But it's a flexible system that can be used to make different statements in different contexts. So that, for instance, in normal circumstances, one of the most polluting forms of food is leftovers on other people's plates. You can guarantee to be polluted if you eat a leftover. But on the other hand, in the context of the temples, people will compete to eat the leftovers of sacrifices, so that the food in normal circumstances, leftover food is polluting, but in special ritual circumstances, leftover food is highly potent and good for you. You will remember I talked about the ambiguity of categories. So here's an example. Here is food and here is non-food. Leftover is halfway between rubbish and good food. And depending on the context, if it's other people's leftovers, it's nasty, dirty, dangerous, polluting. But if it's God's food, if it's God's leftovers, it is safe and potent and good to eat. It all depends on the context. And therefore there's a great deal of room for manipulation. Let's have a look at how people actually manipulate this. One of them is through the hierarchical aspects of hosts and guests. So that a guest is viewed in the system as being indebted and subordinate to the host. And this gives further dimensions to the politics of food. One of the things that means that all hospitality has a kind of competitive aspect, because if you can get people to eat food from you, then it indicates that you are high status. And if in particular you can get people to eat cooked food from you, then it indicates that you are even higher status. So that one of the things the Jains do is to invite, for instance, they will invite the husband's boss to a meal, and they will make sure that they give him lots and lots and lots of cooked food. If he refuses, you lose status. But if he accepts, you gain status, because he's putting himself into a food recipient status and a recipient of potentially dangerous food. So that if your boss will eat your food, then that implies that you're high status. And people do this so that rich Jain businessmen put on huge feasts, so they feed everybody, and the implication is that they are in a food-giving relationship to everybody, and therefore of great high status, so that they manipulate the system of categories in order to increase their status. Now, these feasts mark important events, and one of the most important events is fasting. The feasts actually celebrate fasting. And as I said, food in this system connotes moral statuses, so that some kinds of food, meat, honey, alcohol, garlic, Western manufactured foods, all of these are morally degenerate foods which give you bad health. So don't eat McBurgers, etc. But there are other kinds of food which are pure and give you, which are morally good foods and give you good health. Now, most Jain religious events are marked by changes of diet. And people, when they're fasting, they don't eat foods which heat the body or excite the senses. They only eat foods which are calm, non-sensual, and spiritually high. And these fasts range from not eating and drinking between sunrise and sunset to very elaborate food fasts in which people don't eat anything or drink anything for weeks on end. The high virtuosi people fast for a very long time in order to show how pure and high status they are. And these fasts in the Hindu Jain system, fasts have been used in overtly political contexts, so that, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi, whose mother was a Jain, used fasts as a direct political weapon against the British, so that hunger strikes, this was one of the first examples of hunger strikes, so that this was both a political weapon in the context of colonialism, but it was also at the same time a sign of discipline and purity within the system. And the same is going on in gender politics in the Jain system, so that Jain women fast much more than men. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, because the wife looks after the family diet. In other words, because the wife is the person who is responsible for food, she is therefore notionally responsible for the physical and spiritual health of her family. And therefore, by fasting a lot, the women are signaling that they are much more pure, and therefore that the food that they are preparing for their husbands and families are pure, and therefore by preparing food which is pure from a pure preparer, they are raising their own family's status. But the second reason why women fast more than men has to do with the parallel between eating and sex, which I've already talked about. Fasting is also seen to be a control of the senses. And the people who fast most of all are young women at the age when their parents are seeking suitable husbands for them. And they are especially encouraged to do these virtuosi fasts. They will sometimes fast for 8 days or more. In fact, they mostly manage about 8 days. And in doing this, what they're doing is showing their own control of their desires. In other words, they're showing that they themselves are pure, spiritually pure, morally pure, and that therefore they are eligible to be married, because they, as pure women themselves, won't bring shame upon their husbands' families. And in fact, the girls who fail to fast find it very difficult to get a husband from what is deemed to be a good, i.e. high-status family. And the people who, the other group of people who fast a lot are very old women who are claiming high status within the female status system. There are women who are competing to raise their status above the others. And what they do is they fast all the time. They also avoid housework, and their husbands put on feasts to celebrate their wives' fast, so that there's a double system. The husband is using the feasting system to enhance his prestige, and the wife is using the fasting system to enhance her prestige, and the feasts that mark the fasts go together. So what we see here is the complex and interlocking ways in which what is eaten and what is refused are also they're not simply matters of coding or cultural systems, as Levi-Strauss had supposed. They're also conscious political acts. They make statements about yourself, what kind of a person you are, what kind of status you're claiming, but they also make statements about other people, because depending on what you give to other people and in what form, you can insult them, you can revere them, you can make claims about your equality with them, or you can make claims about your difference from them. And the same is, of course, true, but we use a very different code in our society, but the same is true of our own society. There are many people in Britain who spend a great deal of time giving dinner parties to each other, and what they offer to whom under what circumstances speaks volumes about their own status. You only have to attend British weddings and you will see that very clearly indeed. People blow a very large amount of money on a feast, and that feast is not merely about feeding, it's all about status, politics and wealth. We also put politics into vegetarianism, in the production and trade of animals for meat. And you should note that here the statements are both, on the one hand, they are what we would call iconic statements. In other words, they're statements which are inscribed within the food itself. So that on the one hand, you can make statements simply by eating or not eating. In other words, it's the food itself which carries the message. So that, for instance, fasting connotes discipline. The mere fact of eating or not eating can connote ideas about discipline. But on the other hand, food is also being used as a metaphor for other systems. It's being used as a symbolic system, and I've tried to show you that the symbolism is in part, as Levi-Strauss supposed, but is in part, as Fides makes clear, a symbolism which is contingent, haphazard. Just to finish off, one of the charming things about Fides' book is that Fides says that the cake is an iconic symbol of the bride herself. And for Fides, the cake is the same shape as the bride, which makes you wonder what shape Mrs. Charsley is. Thank you.